Hello, I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. Um, I last left this discussion off with talking about my grandmother starting a sports apparel business, and so it was the case that once she began this business, my sister and myself and my grandfather began helping to contribute to her management of the business. Not really anything um, super involved. She did most of the administrative and labor in terms of things, but my sister and I, we would move boxes and help with um, clothing and everything like that, and building the racks and the models and things like that. But and so we were also still we were doing less traveling and spending more time at Astro World because my grandmother, well, she was trying to start her business and everything like that, so we didn't get to go to um, around the country as much as we used to. And so my life was changing then, and it was my first year of school and everything like that. I got into some trouble, but again, I was really bright as a student and everything like that, and people noticed. And two, at that time in my life, it was so very consistent in my uh, the background and the foreground of my education as a kid that I am someone of African heritage. So my grandmother had a lot of black art in our home, and various different art pieces that represented the different shades of the regions of Africa, from East African to Central African to Sub-Saharan African, uh, and um, Southern African, Northeast, Mid, West, and South. And so we knew Congolese people and Ethiopian. My grandma had Congolese friends and Ethiopian friends and things like that. And so that was a part of my childhood. And so I knew so much about Africa. Not so much about Africa. I mean, I was raised with African cultural heritage in my background, such that I thought I was from Africa whenever I was a kid. My grandmother had to explain to me, because I was going around school telling people I was from Africa, that we're not from Africa. And so I thought, well, yeah, so that's what I thought, but that's not the case. But my grandmother also explained, and that's really how I learned about slavery, because my grandmother, well, because once I find out, well, I'm not from Africa, then why are we here? How did we get here? What? And so that's how I learned about slavery and things like that, in a more detailed way than my grandmother's first introduction of the concept and topic to me. And so that was the deal. So my home life was pretty stable, and I haven't talked much about my grandfather, but my grandfather was somebody who worked in radiology and repairing medical equipment. He was a medical tech, and so he was much more of a. I suspect he was a ISTP, but he was more analytical, introverted to himself. Really worked. He had cars that he worked on. So he worked on his Chevy Chevelle that he was trying to six. I believe it was a '76 Chevy Chevelle that he was remodeling. And so he was into working on engines. He was techie and mechanistically oriented. He worked with his hands and his mind. He liked the intersection of working with his hands and his mind. He had a ton of car magazines. He's also the man that introduced me to many different forms of culture. So my grandmother was more Afrocentric and centered around um, the resurgence of Afrocentrism that was prominent in the 60s and 70s, because that's when she grew up. And so, that's more where her mindset was. And she was very much so about African American excellence, about us striving. and she's a very enterprising and striving person in herself about us owning things and being able to own our own home, owning businesses, and everything like that. Which, if anybody knows about Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party and Stokely Carmichael and James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, everything like that, then they'll be familiar with these ideas. And so my grandmother endorsed these ideas in her lifestyle. And so that's more who my grandmother was. Though my grandmother was super social, it's universally socially amicable. My grandmother had friends that were Kurdish, um, uh, uh, British, French, uh, American. My grandmother is American, which is a funny thing about her, but I think she got very much so used to being around different cultures from living in New York. Um, and my also my extended family, there's a lot of interracial marriages and things like that within my family, and so my grandmother. Well, anyways, so she had a lot of friends, everything from Asian to white people to Latino. And I had an uncle Julio who was Puerto Rican, who was not really my uncle, but I thought Uncle Julio and Aunt Juanita. And so I actually spoke Spanish. I'm weird. Yeah, I'm weird. Kid, I actually spoke Spanish. My grandma would look at me weird, but I speak Espanol to my Uncle Julio and my Aunt Juanita and stuff like that. And my sister, so we had a lot of, and they were my sister's godparents and my grandfather's friends, which is why I'm mentioning them, because my grandfather was very much also, and there were shared friends between the two of them, but my grandfather was very much so interested in Western culture from a broad sense. He liked spaghetti Western movies. He loved kung fu movies. I watched so much Bruce Lee movies growing up in old 60s and 70s kung fu movies and things like that. Which is why other kids were like, "Well, where do you live?" Because it was just I had a very different cultural environment, and both he and my grandmother liked sports. Though he wasn't a fan of it as much as my grandmother was. My grandmother really freaking loves sports. And probably where I get my competitive nature from. She's ridiculously competitive and talks trash if her team wins. Like she's a trash talking harsh kind of sports fan fanatic who will not. My grandma's not nice when it comes to sports, and you will never be able to talk bad about the San Francisco 49ers or anything like that in her presence. Don't ask me. She lived in California. I'm not really sure why, whatever. Anyways, so that's the deal. And so though I was and so as a kid, I was spending a lot of time around my grandfather and my grandmother, and so I was getting a lot of different perspectives on things. We went to church. He did not go to church, so he was much more secular. Though I guess he understood my grand. Well, he had to. He lived with her. He was married to her for 17 or 18 years or something. 18 years, I believe, something like that. So he was not religious, though he did not make it a point to express his disinterest in religiosity, though we were all super, super Christian. Um, and in the normal cultural ways, I mean, I suppose if you think of Christianity in terms of American culture, you read the Bible, you go to church, you act out the ethics, and you are charitable, and you respect your elders, and you work hard. So that was the deal. So that's how my grandmother was basically running that ship and everything like that. And so yeah, and so that was the deal. Now, at some point in time, when around 6 years old, I do start to notice some schisms in our home. My grandfather and grandmother started getting into arguments. A lot, I never, so arguing and, well, so arguing happened a lot in my home, and my grandmother is somebody who's very well competitive and hard nosed and somewhat disagreeable, though she actually is very nice simultaneously. One day, I'm just sitting in the living room, I think, watching PBS or something like that. And they're arguing, and this had become a normative thing, but they really start yelling at one another and everything like that. Um, my grandmother threw a frying pan across the kitchen to the living room, and it got stuck into the wall. And I remember when this happened, I was probably actually only 5 at this point, or 6. 5 or 6. I don't remember. I wasn't very old. I wasn't a very, very little child, but I wasn't very old. And when I saw that, shocked me. And my sister and I knew we had to go into our rooms and go away from it. And so stuff started happening a lot around that time. And so what seemed at first to be a very pleasant and acrimonious home life, we had dogs, we had 2 dogs, and we had 2 cars, 2 nice ones, and a nice home, and people had jobs and everything like that. My grandmother quit her job to run her business and to take care of us basically at a compact. Well, once you have a settlement and things like that. I mean, even after the settlement, she was still working for them, but she just decided she has $100,000 and she has another business, and she has my sister and myself to take care of, so she just stopped working. And so I think within a year, so my grandmother got that business. Whenever from she had that business from the time I was 4 to 5 years old. After that, she sold it. So around this time, I'm 6 years old, is when the schisms, I suppose, start happening. And so so they started arguing and everything like that. And my grandmother was working at her business. And so while my grandmother, because she worked in the evening times, not really sure how this works. So she worked in the evening times. My grandfather started picking us up from school and everything like that. And my grandmother worked in the evenings and sometimes at night. She didn't get home before 9 p.m., I want to say, something like that, because we had babysitters at times. That's where I met my first crush. So I don't think I'm unique in that. My babysitters was my first real crush in life. Anyways, yeah. Anyways, I know. So yeah, she was coming. She came home late because of her work. And so my grandfather got because he worked on call and at different hours of the night. He had a company car and everything like that. 2 personal cars and a company car, so it was 3 vehicles. And so he was watching over my sister and myself, and so at one point in time, I'm not really sure when this began. He began waking my sister and I up and taking us in his van and going to meet someone. And so after I think about a month of this, one night, my sister wakes me up, Joshua, look. And so she points to the fact that my grandfather is kissing this other woman who we're kind of half asleep. Well, my sister's not, she's awake, but I'm half asleep. But I know clearly that that's not my grandmother. My sister knows it's not my grandmother, and she doesn't know what to say. I don't know what to say. Basically, we look at one another and think we need to go back to sleep. And so we went back to sleep, and our grandfather tucked us away and everything like that. And so yeah, so this went on for a few more nights until my grandmother, being the strict disciplinarian that she is and everything like that, when she says she wants us up at 6 a.m., which we woke up at 6 a.m. every day to get ready for school, she meant she wanted us up at 6 a.m. And so if we weren't up at 6 a.m., that light was going to come on really fast and violently, and she was about to yell at us, like, why aren't you kids? Because after my grandmother works like this, she's going to demonstrate it to you once, then help you do it, and then you're on your own after that point, and she expects it to be done. My grandmother is super, super conscientious. And so that's how it was. And so we weren't up, and so she starts raising sand, is her expression. And so she was raising sin and sand all through the hallway, and my sister and I are really tired because we had been out super late. So my grandfather and his girlfriend, and so we were about to get a spanking for this and everything like that because my grandmother was spare the rod, spoil the child. And my sister was like, what do I do? Like, what do I say? She's looking at me. We're both looking at each other like, oh my God, we're about to get it. And she's like, should I tell her? And me, I was not a fan of getting spanking. So I was like, yes, you need to tell grandma. Like, you need to say it, and I will cooperate with you because I saw it too. Because I'm not trying to get spanked. Though Joshua was just trying to save his skin. He didn't really know what he was doing or anything like that. I didn't know the consequences of what was going on. I just knew something bad was, afoot, but I didn't really know the severity of anything like that. And so when my sister and myself told my grandmother, I never saw the expression on her face change as rapidly or as drastically as she did, as it did. And I have also never been told to stand outside of the house and also be able to hear yelling and yelling, like serious yelling and everything like that. And by the time the yelling stopped, my sister and I couldn't stand standing outside the house and not know what's going on because, from our vantage point, these are our parents, so we don't know what's going on and everything like that. We're pretty anxious. And so I come inside, and then I see my grandfather with a bag in his hand, and I ask him, well, are we going on a vacation, or are we going on a trip? I didn't know what was going on. So I knew, but I didn't know what was going on. I didn't want to know. That's the way I'd put it. It's where my first philosophical insight came from after that day, because I knew what was going on. I did not want to know what was going on because I didn't want what was happening to happen, but I knew. And I held onto my grandfather's leg and I asked him not to go, but that was it. That was it. And so they got a divorce soon after. And soon after, serious, like, so I'd put it like this. um, my grandmother sold her business. She wasn't working currently at that point in time. They spent most of the savings on their various ventures, her business or whatever. Um, and my grandfather is paying the house note, which is, according to my grandmother, about $1,200. So, and we're living fine. I mean, like, no big deal or anything like that. But my grandmother, she's not in a financial position to um, do anything like that. Was not in a financial position to pay for anything like that, and a economic recession was starting to creep in. So this is not quite there yet, but when one analyzes like the economic progress of America from at least like the early 90s to 2000s, we're in 1990. Born in 92. Um, 1998. So it's, yeah, it's going down, down. It's going, yeah, yeah. So it got really, really bad. Because my grandmother. Let's talk about more about something, I guess, like as it pertains to African ancestry. So African people have different values than West Western Christian people. Um, uh, because, well, it's a different culture. And so my grandmother's very proud, very, very proud, like extremely proud, very, very proud. And she does not believe in charity and things like that. At least she didn't, she done none of that, none of those things. And so whenever we hit hard financial times, my grandmother got two jobs, and started working at night and everything like that. And so my sister and I went from a very, I guess, supervised situation to a non-supervised situation, and a very financially rich situation with many, many different kinds of differentiating opportunities to none of that. So I went from being able to travel and meet a whole bunch of different people and everything like that to being locked inside of a cage. It felt like, with no opportunity to do anything and go anywhere. It was extremely psychologically jarring to me. I'm not kidding. It was extremely psychologically jarring to me. It's where I really started to think about life and things, and what was going on, uncertainty and everything like that. It just started creeping into the picture. Because when I say that, so I mean, I can analogize it. I'll put it like this. So whenever something like this happens, so as I had the hangover still from the day he left. And so in that hangover sort of state, whenever you're contemplating anomaly or chaos or something like that, the negative aspects of chaos, it's just hard. It's a lot to process. You don't really know what to think, and you don't really want to pay attention to things. So I remember, and it happens gradually. It just happens gradually. It happens very fast, but it happens gradually. At first, well, we can't do this. Oh, okay, we can't do that anymore. Oh, we're not going here. Oh, we stopped going on vacations. Everything like that just happens gradually. Oh, I'm sorry, we're only going to get you two outfits for your, uh, starting at your next semester at school. We can't get that as many groceries as we got before. It's like, what? I can't have. I can't have. I'm telling you. And so you're not very happy about any of these changes or anything like that. But nothing is like dawningly obvious to you that everything's changed, like, and it's changed forever. It's never going back. You're still wondering, when are things gonna go back to the way that they once were? No, 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 it's not happening. It's not happening. And then whenever the lights get turned off, it dawns on you that this is no longer the same world. It's not happening anymore. Whenever it's the case that grandma's not home whenever you get home from school, nothing like that. The house is empty, everything like that. The music is playing, but there's no one around singing and dancing and everything like that. And everybody is shocked, everybody is anxious, everybody is stressed. People are having a hard time sleeping, whether or not you're talking about adults or children. And sometimes we're just not eating. And this is just the first year. And so I'd put it to you like this. You can imagine that uh, whoever I was prior to that, I was not the same person after. And this is where my ideation and philosophy began, because the one thing I realized very quickly is that whatever it means to be human, it's a very, very, very psychological trip, because my house didn't look the same to me. And I didn't start thinking these things like right off the bat. I'm telling you that. I didn't start thinking these things right off the bat. But whenever you have these summers when you're away from school and your grandmother's working all year long and you can't, and she's super authoritarian and uh a helicopter parent, very much so. You're not going outside and playing until she gets home and things like that. If you're going to go outside and play, if she doesn't have things that she wants you to do for her and things like that. Because to be frank, from my grandmother's perspective, so my grandmother was raised on a farm, so that should tell you to some extent of what her values were about a child's role in a home. She's supposed to take care of the kids and everything like that, but it's the kid. So the kids are supposed to also help and contribute in taking care of the home, and especially because she had to work very much. Now I became a fully responsible person. I'm not going to say I was an adult or something like that, but when I tell you Joshua met responsibility at a very early age, I met responsibility. I was also still super bohemian, liberal, eccentric something. So this was a very, very hard adjustment for me. I remember I had to have keys. Never had keys before. Never had to be responsible for locking the house and everything like that, but I had to be responsible for all those things. I'm not going to tell you how many times I lost those keys and was definitely terrified of the fact that I had to tell my grandmother that I lost my keys again. Like, like it was a real thing. It was a real thing. And so eventually, this is where it became very apparent that I was disagreeable universally because I traded defiance and rebellion for fear. So that's the way I'd put it. But really, in that time space, I watched in just a matter of months my entire life change. Like, very really. We stayed in the same home. We stayed in the same house, that's what I should put it, but it was no longer the same home. It wasn't bright and vibrant or anything like that. My grandmother used to, I guess, provide so many amenities for my sister and myself in order to make us feel like we belonged in that space and everything like that, such that, that just disappeared completely. And because these things happen, I had to start spending more time around my mother because, well, we are my mother's children, and so my grandmother wasn't going to pay for daycare and things like that. And my mother didn't work and everything like that, so she said you were going to take and watch over these children while I go to work every now and then. And that was a thing. And so we spent a lot of time at my mother's house. And when I tell you I didn't know my mother before I met my mother, I didn't know my mother before I met my mother. And when I can say that my grandmother and my mother have different values, they definitely have different values because where my grandmother's Afrocentric and I'm not Afrocentric and I'm not a fan of black popular culture. But yeah, so well, I gotta go get the door, and so I'll leave the video here for part 3. Thank you for watching.